the first thing you register is not a sight or a sound, but a feeling, the gentle, ceaseless rocking of the deck beneath you. For weeks, this has been your entire world. A universe of creaking timbers, the sour stench of bilge water, and the low murmurs of a language you do not understand. You have been kept below, in the dark, with others like you. Boys whose names you have learned in whispered fragments, and whose faces you have only glimpsed in the slivers of light that pierce the gloom. But today is different. The anchor has dropped. Harsh shouts echo from above, and the hatch is thrown open, flooding the space with a light so brilliant it is physically painful. You are herded onto the main deck, blinking, your eyes streaming, trying to make sense of the overwhelming sea. You are in a harbor of impossible scale, surrounded by hundreds of ships. The air, thick with the smell of salt, fish, and exotic spices, is filled with a cacophony of voices from every corner of the known world. Before you, the city rises on 7 hills, its skyline a forest of slender minarets and magnificent domes that seem to scratch the heavens. This is Constantinople, the jewel of the world, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but you are not a visitor. You are not a visitor. You are cargo that has just reached its port. Lined up on the pier, you and the others are made to stand straight, stripped to the waist. Men in elaborate robes and towering turbans walk down the line, their faces impassive. They inspect you as a farmer inspects livestock, forcing your mouth open to check your teeth, turning your head to examine your profile, running their hands over your arms and back to assess your build. Then one of them stops. He stops in front of you, with eyes that seem to hold no light, and his face is unnaturally smooth. He says nothing. He simply looks. It is a gaze that weighs you, measures you, and strips you of everything you were. In that silent moment, your past is incinerated. Your future is decided. You have been chosen. This experience, or a variation of it, was the terrifying prelude to a life of utter subjugation. Before we pull back the curtain on this forgotten tragedy, take a moment to like and subscribe. Consider it your ticket to the forbidden sections of history's library. And in the comments below, we invite you to share your thoughts on who you believe is the most misunderstood figure in history. The pleasantries are concluded. Let us now descend the spiral staircase of history into the chambers where the echoes still scream. The acquisition of young men for the inner service of the Ottoman Sultan was a highly structured and multifaceted process, essential for the perpetuation of a system built on absolute loyalty to a single master. The individuals who populated the Sultan's private world, particularly those destined for the palace school, known as the Enderun, were sought through 3 primary channels. The first and perhaps most infamous was the devsermi, or the child levy. This was a systematic tribute imposed upon the Christian populations of the Balkans and Anatolia. Every few years, imperial officials would tour these provinces and select the most promising boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18. While the devsermi is most commonly associated with the recruitment of janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, the most physically perfect and intellectually sharp of these boys, were funneled directly into the palace system. It was a devastating loss, the son legally unculturally erased from their lineage forever. For the empire, it was a method of acquiring raw human capital, untethered to any Turkish noble family and thus, in theory, incapable of forming rival power bases. A second major source was warfare. Following successful military campaigns, a significant portion of the spoils of war, including human captives, was legally designated as the Sultan's property. Young men and boys taken from captured territories from Central Europe to Persia, from the Caucasus to North Africa were sent to the capital. These captives were assessed for their potential upon arrival. Those with striking features, signs of high birth, or demonstrable intelligence were separated from the general pool of slaves and reserved for palace consideration. The third channel was tribute and diplomacy. Governors of distant provinces, vassal kings, and foreign dignitaries often sent gifts to the Sultan to demonstrate their loyalty or curry favor. Among the silks, jewels, and exotic animals, the most prized offerings were often beautiful and talented young men. These individuals, often of noble or even royal blood from their homelands, arrived in Constantinople not as coarse prisoners of war, but as polished political commodities. their value intrinsically linked to their beauty and potential for service. Regardless of the method of acquisition, levy, capture, or gift, the initial selection process was brutally pragmatic. The officials tasked with this duty, chief among them the copyager, or the chief white eunuch who guarded the inner palace, were expert evaluators of human potential. The criteria were specific. Physical perfection was paramount. A candidate had to be free of any blemishes, scars, or deformities. Symmetrical features, clear eyes, and a healthy physique were non-negotiable prerequisites. Beyond mere health, a specific aesthetic ideal was sought, one that aligned with the prevailing tastes of the court at the time. But the assessment went deeper than the physical. Selectors were trained to look for a spark of intelligence, a quickness in the eyes, a sign of a sharp and adaptable mind. At the same time, they were screening for temperament. A rebellious spirit or overt defiance would be a liability, marking a boy for a lesser, more arduous fate. The ideal candidate possessed a combination of intelligence and perceived malleability, the potential to be educated, refined, and ultimately, completely controlled. The gaze of the selector was therefore the first and most critical gate. It was an instrument of imperial policy, a cold, analytical tool that separated the valuable from the disposable. To be chosen was not an honor, it was a sentence. It marked the end of one's life and the beginning of one's function as an object, a vessel to be emptied of its past and filled with a new, singular purpose, the service and pleasure of the Sultan. The moment a boy passed this inspection and entered the gates of the Topkapi Palace, he ceased to be a person and became an imperial asset. This transformation from person to asset began immediately upon crossing the threshold of the Gate of Felicity, the entrance to the palace's innermost sanctum. The process was not one of gentle assimilation but of systematic and total deconstruction. The first step was the shearing of hair. Whatever style the boy wore, a marker of his regional origin or familial custom, was shaved away. This was a powerful and public act of humiliation and uniformity, instantly removing a key feature of his former self. His rough, travel-worn clothes were taken and burned, replaced by a simple, identical uniform of coarse linen. This new attire had no connection to his past and served to visually dissolve him into a collective of anonymous novices. He was now indistinguishable from the boy standing to his left or right, the first lesson in a world where individuality was a liability. Following this physical stripping, the assault on identity moved to a deeper, more fundamental level: language. A strict and brutally enforced rule of silence. Whether a boy's mind was filled with Greek, Serbian, Hungarian, or Circassian, he was forbidden from uttering a single word of it. To be caught speaking the language of one's birth would result in a severe beating. This policy was a masterstroke of psychological control. It severed the last audible link to home, to memory, to prayer, to the lullabies of his mother. It also prevented the boys from forming factions based on shared ethnic or regional origins. They were plunged into a state of profound isolation, unable to communicate their fear or confusion to those who might understand it best. Their only path out of this silence was the arduous and mandatory study of Ottoman Turkish, the language of their masters. Communication itself became conditional upon embracing the culture of their captors. The next stage in this systematic erasure was religious conversion. For the vast majority of these boys, sought from the Christian Balkan territories, this meant a forced conversion to Islam. It was not a matter of choice or spiritual awakening. It was a prerequisite for survival and advancement within the palace system. The process was formalized and non-negotiable. Each boy was brought before an official and made to recite the declaration of faith, affirming the oneness of God and the prophethood of Muhammad. This verbal declaration was sealed with a permanent, physical alteration, circumcision. This act served as an undeniable, irreversible mark of their new religious identity, separating them forever from their Christian roots and making any thought of returning to their old communities an impossibility. They were now, in body as well as by decree, members of the ruling faith. This was followed by intensive religious instruction, where they were drilled in the core tenets of Islam, taught how to perform the 5 daily prayers, and began the long process of memorizing the Quran. Their former faith was not merely replaced, it was treated as a void, a primitive error that had now been corrected. Finally, with his physical appearance, language, and religion stripped away, The last vestige of his old self was ready to be formally extinguished. He was given a new name. This name was not of his choosing. It was bestowed upon him by his new master, typically the chief white eunuch. His birth name Ivan, Demetrios, or Stefan was discarded, never to be spoken again. In its place came a name of Turkish, Arabic, or most commonly, Persian origin, chosen for its poetic quality or auspicious meaning. He might be called Gul, the Rose, Iqbal, the Fortunate, or Yusuf, after the famously handsome prophet. This new name was a final seal of ownership. It signified that his very identity was now a gift from the Sultan, a new label for a new creation. He was no longer the son of a Balkan farmer or a Caucasian chieftain. He was an imperial servitor, a palace page, whose entire existence was now defined by his relationship to the throne. The cumulative effect of these methodical steps was one of profound psychological dislocation. Within a matter of weeks, a boy's entire world, his family, his home, his name had been systematically dismantled and replaced. He was rendered a blank slate, deliberately and efficiently. The purpose was not merely to control him, but to remake him entirely. The institution required individuals with no prior allegiances, no familial ambitions, no regional loyalties that could ever compete with their absolute devotion to the person of the Sultan. This era soil was the essential foundation upon which a new identity, that of the perfect, loyal, and utterly dependent servant of the empire, could be constructed. This remade individual, this newly named and newly defined asset, was then placed into a meticulously designed environment. The architecture of his new home was not incidental. It was an active and crucial instrument in his continued conditioning. The Topkapi Palace, or Topkapi Saray, was not merely a residence for the Sultan. It was a self-contained universe, a complex machine engineered for the sole purpose of projecting, protecting, and perpetuating imperial power. The Enderun, its very layout, was a constant, silent lesson in hierarchy, isolation, and surveillance. The palace was structured as a series of 3 concentric courts, each representing a deeper level of sanctity and a higher degree of exclusion, a physical progression from the public world to the Sultan's absolute privacy. The first court, known as the Court of the Janissaries, was the most accessible. It was a semi-public space that any subject of the empire could enter. It housed service buildings, a hospital, and the imperial mint. It was here that the elite Janissary Corps would muster, their presence a constant invisible reminder of the Sultan's military might. For a new page, passing through this court was his last contact with the wider world. It was loud, bustling, and relatively open, but it served as a formidable buffer zone, filtering the chaos of the city from the ordered sanctum of the state. To proceed deeper, one had to pass through the imperial gate, or the gate of salutation, into the second court. Here, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Access was strictly limited to imperial officials, members of the judiciary, and foreign envoys on official business. This was the administrative heart of the empire. It contained the imperial council chambers, or divan, where the Grand Vizier and other high ministers met to govern the vast territories. Capable of feeding thousands, were also located here, a testament to the palace's scale. The second court was a place of immense power and rigid protocol, where the business of the state was conducted. Yet, even this was merely a prelude. The true world of the Sultan's servitors lay beyond another, even more formidable barrier. This barrier was the Gate of Felicity, the Babus Adi, guarded day and night by the chief white eunuch and his subordinates. This gate was the point of no return. No one passed through it without the express permission of the Sultan himself. It was the threshold to the third court, the Enderun, the inner sanctum of the palace. This was the Sultan's private domain, and it was here that the palace pages lived, studied, and served. The architecture of the third court was a masterpiece of control. It was designed to be a hermetically sealed environment, a gilded cage from which escape was conceptually, as well as physically, impossible. The residential and educational areas of the Enderun were organized into a series of chambers or wards, known as Oda. A new boy would begin his life in the so-called great or small chambers, living in a communal dormitory under constant supervision. As he progressed in his education and proved his loyalty, he might be promoted to more prestigious chambers, such as the campaign chamber or the treasury, each with increasing responsibilities and proximity to the Sultan's own quarters. This physical movement through the palace's geography was a tangible representation of his career path. His very location within the building was a constant reminder of his status, his ambitions, and the precariances of his position. Furthermore, the design of the Enderun facilitated total surveillance. The chambers were arranged around a central courtyard, overlooked by the quarters of the eunuch overseers. High, windowless walls faced the outside world, severing any visual connection to the city that lay just beyond. The boys could perhaps see the tops of the minarets or hear the distant call to prayer, but the world of ordinary people was rendered an abstraction. Their reality was confined to the courtyards, the fountains, the libraries, and the chambers of the inner palace. There were few private spaces. Sleeping, eating, studying, and praying were largely communal activities, performed under the watchful eyes of their superiors. This lack of privacy was intentional, designed to prevent the formation of conspiracies, and to enforce a culture of collective discipline. The very stones of the palace were aligned to remind its inhabitants that they were always being watched, their every action noted and judged. The gilded cage was not just a metaphor, it was a physical and psychological reality, an environment expertly crafted to isolate its inhabitants from the outside world and bind them ever more tightly to the center of power. If the architecture of the third court was the cage, its bars were forged and maintained by a unique class of men, the white eunuchs. Presiding over this sealed world, they were the enforcers of its rules, the arbiters of its discipline, and the silent, ever-present conduits of the Sultan's will. Their authority within the Enderun was total and unquestionable, and at their apex stood the single most powerful official within the palace walls after the Sultan himself, the chief white eunuch, the Copyaga. It was his shadow that fell longest across the lives of the palace pages, his gaze the one they learned to fear above all others. His very existence was a testament to the fundamental logic of the Ottoman system, which demanded that power be divorced from the potential for biological succession. The institution of eunuchs was a solution to a political problem. A man who could not father children could not establish a dynasty. He could not plot to place his own son on the throne. His ambition, therefore, could be entirely channeled into the service of the master who created and sustained him. Castration was a brutal but effective tool for manufacturing loyalty. It created a third gender, a class of individuals who belonged neither to the world of ordinary men nor to the sequestered world of women. This profound alienation bound them inextricably to the Sultan's court, the only place where they could accrue immense power and status. The white eunuchs, primarily sourced from European captives, were specifically tasked with the administration of the palace outside the female harem. They were the headmasters, the chamberlains, and the wardens of the Sultan's male servitors. The Copyaga was the master of this entire domain. As the Lord of the Gate, he controlled the Babu Sodi, the Gate of Felicity, and thus controlled all physical access to the Sultan. No one entered or left the third court without his knowledge and permission. This position made him the essential intermediary for every official, minister, and petitioner who sought an audience with the ruler. He was the gatekeeper not just to a physical space, but to the very font of imperial power, and he accrued enormous influence simply by deciding who could approach it and when. Within the Enderun, his role was even more absolute. He was the head of the entire palace school. He oversaw the curriculum, the assignments of the tutors, and the daily regimen of the pages. He held the power of promotion and demotion, deciding which boys would advance to more prestigious chambers and which would languish in obscurity. He was the chief disciplinarian, the ultimate authority to whom all infractions were reported. A favorable report from the Copyaga could accelerate a page's career, bringing him to the Sultan's attention. A negative report could lead to severe punishment, expulsion from the school, or a fate far worse. The authority of the Copyaga was enforced by a hierarchy of subordinate white eunuchs who acted as his eyes and ears. These eunuchs served as the direct overseers of the various chambers, living among the pages, monitoring their progress, and enforcing the myriad rules of palace life. They moved through the corridors and courtyards with a practiced quietness, their smooth, beardless faces betraying no emotion. their smooth, beardless faces betraying no emotion. Their silence was one of their most effective tools. Low-level anxiety. A page was never truly sure when he was being observed or what was being noted. A careless word, a lazy posture, a moment of prohibited camaraderie, all could be observed unreported up the chain of command. This silent, pervasive surveillance was a constant psychological pressure, forcing the pages to internalize the rules of the institution until obedience became second nature. For a young page, the relationship with these unit masters was one of profound and terrified dependence. They were the sole source of authority in his world. They were the ones who explained his duties, corrected his mistakes, and meted out his punishments. They were also the figures he had to please in order to survive and advance. He learned to read their subtle expressions, to anticipate their demands, and to conduct himself with a flawless mixture of deference and deficiency. His life was a continuous performance for this silent, watchful audience. The eunuchs were not merely guards, they were the sculptors of his new identity, using the tools of fear, discipline, and the remote possibility of favor to shape him into the perfect imperial servant. Their silence was not an absence of sound, it was the sound of absolute power, a pervasive quiet that filled every corner of the gilded cage. The authority of the eunuch overseers was not a theoretical concept, it was a tangible and ever-present force, maintained by a system of discipline that was immediate, severe, and brutally clear. The culture of the Enderun was not one of encouragement or gentle correction. It was a crucible designed to burn away imperfection through the application of swift and memorable pain. The price of a mistake, no matter how trivial, was intentionally disproportionate to the offense itself. This was a core principle of the school's pedagogy to create individuals who were so terrified of the consequences of a minor error that the thought of a major transgression would be inconceivable. The system was designed to cultivate a state of hypervigilance, a constant, internalized awareness of the myriad rules, both spoken and unspoken, that governed every moment of a page's existence. The range of punishable infractions was vast and seemingly infinite. A lapse into one's native language was a direct challenge to the policy of identity erasure and was met with immediate corporal punishment. A sloppily arranged bed, an improperly tied sash on a uniform, or dust found on a designated cleaning surface were treated as signs of a flawed character and unwillingness to submit to the institution's demand for total order. During lessons, a moment of inattention, a yawn, or a failure to answer a question with sufficient speed and clarity could result in a summons for discipline. In the dining halls, reaching for a dish out of turn or making too much noise while eating was an offense. Even a page's physical comportment was subject to constant scrutiny. A slouching posture, a gait that was deemed insufficiently graceful, or a failure to lower one's eyes in the presence of a superior were all grounds for correction. The primary instrument of this correction was the FALOCA, or bastinado. This method was favored for its cruel efficiency and its calculated preservation of the page's primary value, his physical appearance. The offender would be brought to a designated area, often in a semi-public space, to serve as a lesson to others. He would be forced to the ground, and his ankles would be bound and inserted into a loop of rope or leather attached to a heavy wooden pole. Two other pages or eunuch attendants would then lift the pole, raising the soles of the boy's feet to the air, rendering him immobile and completely vulnerable. The disciplinarian, typically a eunuch, would then administer a prescribed number of blows to the bare soles of the feet with a thin, hard rod, often made of dogwood or rattan. The pain of the FALOCA was excruciating, capable of incapacitating the recipient for days. Yet, it was a strategically chosen form of punishment. It left no lasting marks on the parts of the body that were visible. The face, the hands, the torso, the aesthetic qualities for which the boy had been selected remained unblemished. He could be punished with extreme severity without diminishing his value as a beautiful object. The FALOCA was a tool of pain, humiliation, and control that did not damage the asset. Beyond physical punishment, other methods were employed to break the will and enforce conformity. Solitary confinement in a small, dark, and often windowless cell for a period of hours or days was a common punishment for defiance or insubordination. This sensory deprivation was designed to disorient the individual and underscore his complete dependence on the institution for light, food, and human contact. Public humiliation was another powerful tool. A page might be forced to stand motionless in a central courtyard for an entire day, exposed to the elements and the silent judgment of his peers. Alternatively, leading under menial tasks, such as cleaning latrines, a stark reminder of his lowliness and the ease with which his status could be revoked. This entire system of punishment was not arbitrary. It was a calculated methodology of psychological conditioning. The goal was to traumatize the pages to prevent the formation of any solidarity that might challenge the authority of their masters. By punishing minor infractions so severely, the institution ensured that each boy was focused solely on his own flawless performance. Comradeship became a risk, another's mistake could inadvertently implicate you, and your own mistake could bring collective punishment. This fostered an environment of intense, quiet competition and mutual suspicion. Each page learned that his survival depended on his own perfection and his ability to remain unnoticed by the disciplinarians unless it was for a positive reason. The constant threat of pain and humiliation was the invisible framework upon which the entire educational structure was built. Foundational lesson that had to be absorbed before any other learning could begin. Obedience was not a choice, but the absolute, non-negotiable condition of existence. Once the foundation of absolute obedience was laid through the constant threat of punishment, the more sophisticated process of intellectual and cultural reconstruction could commence. The institution did not desire mindless automatons. It required highly refined, intelligent, and cultured individuals who could serve the Sultan in a variety of capacities, from personal attendants to future administrators of the empire. The education provided within the Enderun was therefore as intensive and rigorous as any in the world. But its ultimate purpose was not to liberate the mind, but to bind it more completely to the imperial will. This re-education rested on three pillars: the mastery of the master's tongue, the internationalization of courtly conduct, and a deep indoctrination in the state's religion. The first and most critical pillar was the acquisition of Ottoman Turkish. This was far more than a simple exercise in language learning. Ottoman Turkish, the language of the court, was a complex and nuanced instrument of power. Its structure was Turkic, but its vocabulary was a vast and intricate tapestry woven from Persian, the language of literature and art, and Arabic, the language of literature and art, and Arabic, the language of religion and science. To master, it was to absorb the high culture of the Islamic world. The pedagogical method was one of total immersion, enforced by the strict prohibition of any other language. Tutors, known as lolas, were assigned to the pages. These were learned men, often scholars or poets themselves, and their instruction was demanding. The curriculum began with basic literacy and grammar, but quickly advanced to the study of classical texts. Pages were required to read and memorize the great works of Persian poets like Sodi, Hafez, and Rumi, as well as the masterpieces of Ottoman literature. Calligraphy was a mandatory skill, with endless hours spent practicing the elegant scripts, turning the written word itself into a form of disciplined art. The goal was not mere fluency but eloquence. A page was expected to be able to compose poetry, to understand subtle wordplay, to deploy a well-chosen verse in conversation, and to speak with a precise and pleasing accent. This linguistic refinement served a dual purpose. It equipped them to appreciate and participate in the sophisticated culture of the court, and it provided a clear, audible marker of their status and training, distinguishing them from the common people of the empire. The second pillar was the exhaustive study of court etiquette. If language was the software of the new identity, etiquette was its operating system, governing every physical movement and social interaction. This was a complex and unforgiving grammar of behavior, where the slightest error could have severe repercussions. Pages were drilled relentlessly in the physical manifestation of hierarchy. They learned the precise angle of a bow required for different ranks of officials. They were taught to walk silently, to enter and leave a room without drawing attention, and to stand for hours motionless and alert, in the presence of superiors. They learned the intricate rituals of service, how to present a cup of water or a dish of food, ensuring their thumb never touched the rim, how to fold a turban or a robe, how to hold a candle or a censer at the correct height and distance. This training extended to every aspect of their being. They were taught to control their facial expressions, maintaining a mask of pleasant neutrality unless an emotional response was required by the situation. Above all, They learned the art of the gaze, when to make eye contact, and when to lower their eyes in a show of deference. This was not simply a list of rules. It was a complete physical ray engineering, designed to produce a body that was graceful, efficient, and visibly subservient. Every gesture was a performance of loyalty, a constant, non-verbal affirmation of the Sultan's absolute authority and their own subordinate position within the palace structure. The third pillar was a deep dive into Islamic theology, building upon their initial forced conversion. This was the ideological framework that gave meaning and justification to their entire existence. The curriculum was comprehensive, including Quranic recitations of the Prophet Muhammad and an introduction to Islamic law. The core message, woven through every lesson, was the divine right of the Sultan. He was presented not merely as a political leader, but as the shadow of God on earth. Therefore, service to the Sultan was reframed as a form of religious devotion. Obedience was a sacred duty, and disloyalty was not just a crime against the state but a sin against God. This theological indoctrination was a powerful psychological tool, designed to transform their enslavement into a righteous calling and to preempt any thought of rebellion by defining it as an act of sacrilege. Together, these three pillars of education, language, etiquette, and theology forged a new man, one whose mind, body, and soul had been meticulously reshaped to be a perfect instrument of imperial service. While the formal, explicit hierarchy of the Enderun from novice to senior page, from one chamber to the next, was the skeleton of palace life, it was not its living, breathing reality. Beneath this official structure, a second, far more complex and dangerous hierarchy pulsed with its own unspoken rules and currencies of power. This was the informal ladder of rank, a social ecosystem that flourished in the dormitories, courtyards, and training halls just beyond the direct gaze of the eunuch masters. For a new page, learning to navigate this treacherous internal landscape was as crucial to his survival as mastering Ottoman Turkish or the art of the bowl. Failure to understand this unspoken order could lead to a life of quiet misery and constant torment. The most fundamental rung on this ladder was seniority. The boys who had been in the palace longer, the veterans of its brutal indoctrination, held an automatic and almost feudal authority over the newcomers, the Asmiogl and Ma. These senior pages, sometimes referred to informally as aghas or masters by the novices, were the repositories of the institution's unwritten laws. They knew which eunuchs were prone to violent outbursts, which tutors could be subtly flattered, and which corridors were best avoided at certain hours. They served as the primary transmitters of the Enderun's culture, but this mentorship was rarely benign. It was a relationship of dominance and submission. A novice was expected to show absolute deference to a senior page, to step aside when he passed, to remain silent unless spoken to, and to perform small, menial services upon demand. This authority often manifested in the appropriation of better food portions, the claiming of more comfortable sleeping mats, or the imposition of a senior's cleaning duties onto a junior. Resistance was unthinkable and would result in swift, collective punishment from the senior cohort, a beating delivered in a secluded corner where the cries would not reach the ears of an overseer. Beyond the simple calculus of age and tenure, status was determined by demonstrated talent. In an environment of intense competition, excellence in one of the required disciplines became a significant form of social capital. The page with the most elegant calligraphic hand, whose work was praised by the tutors, earned a measure of respect. The one whose voice was most melodic during Quranic recitation, or who could compose the most moving line of poetry, gained a certain prestige. Skill in martial arts, archery, wrestling, or horsemanship also commanded admiration, as it hinted at a future of military or administrative power. These talents were not merely academic pursuits, they were markers of potential. A gifted page was more likely to be noticed by the copyager, more likely to be chosen for a special assignment, and ultimately, more likely to be presented to the Sultan. This potential for advancement made him a figure of both respect and intense jealousy among his peers. The most potent and volatile element in this informal hierarchy, however, was physical beauty. Since the primary reason for their selection was their aesthetic appeal, it was inevitable that a pecking order based on attractiveness would emerge. The boy who was considered the most beautiful by the silent consensus of his peers possessed an immense, albeit dangerous, form of power. He was the one most likely to achieve the ultimate goal, catching the Sultan's eye and becoming a favorite. This status afforded him a certain untouchable quality. Other pages, and even junior eunuchs, might be hesitant to cross him, wary of the potential consequences should he gain the Sultan's ear. This beauty was a double-edged sword. It made him a target of predatory interest from older pages and officials, and it bred a deep and corrosive resentment among his rivals. His position was one of constant vigilance, for his primary asset was also his greatest vulnerability. This unspoken ladder was not static. It was a fluid, ever-shifting system of alliances, rivalries, and subtle power plays. Status could be gained by forming a protective bond with a more powerful senior page, or lost through a single act of social clumsiness. It was a world governed by glances, whispers, and the calculated Yusion's masters were not ignorant of this internal dynamic. In fact, they tacitly allowed and even encouraged it. This internal competition served their purposes perfectly. It kept the pages focused inward, competing against one another for scraps of status and favor, rather than uniting to question the system that imprisoned them. By allowing the boys to police and terrorize one another, the eunuchs maintained a deeper level of control. The unspoken ladder was not a flaw in the system, it was one of its most brutally effective features, another invisible bar on the gilded cage. In the face of the brutal, informal hierarchy and the constant surveillance of the eunuchs, the most critical survival skill a new page had to master was not one of assertion, but of self-effacement. It was the sophisticated and deeply counterintuitive art of being invisible. This was not a passive state of being overlooked, but an active, calculated strategy of existing within the palace's intricate social ecosystem without creating any discernible ripple. To draw attention, positive or negative, was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in the Enderun was invariably a prelude to danger. The path to survival, let alone advancement, began with a period of deliberate, strategic obscurity. The page had to learn to become a ghost in his own life, a silent observer gathering the data necessary to navigate the treacherous currents of power that defined his world. The first principle of this art was the control of the gaze. While the pages were explicitly taught to lower their eyes in the presence of superiors, the truly adept student learned to see without being seen to be looking. He trained his peripheral vision to become his primary to love perception. He registered the subtle shifts in posture as a senior page entered a room, the almost imperceptible tightening of a eunuch's jaw that signaled displeasure, the fleeting exchange of glances between two rivals across the dining hall. His mind became a repository of these minute observations, a constantly updated map of the emotional and political landscape. Who was asked to assist a prestigious tutor? Who was given a slightly better quality uniform? Who was addressed with a tone of warmth, however fleeting, by the copy-aga? These were the essential data points in the calculus of palace life. This psychological cartography extended to every corner of the Enderun. The page learned the patterns of his captors. He knew which eunuch overseer was prone to rage in the early morning, and which was more lenient after the evening meal. He memorized the footfalls of different officials in the corridor, allowing him to anticipate their arrival and adjust his posture accordingly. He listened to the whispers that circulated after dark in the dormitories, but he never contributed a rumor of his own. He became an expert in the palace's oral tradition, learning of past favorites who had fallen from grace, of punishments meted out for forgotten transgressions. He absorbed these stories not as gossip, but as case studies in a brutal science of power, valuable lessons paid for by the suffering of others. His invisibility was a shield that allowed him to conduct this vital intelligence gathering without risk. This strategy was manifested in his physical presence. He strove for a perfect, unremarkable mediocrity in his daily duties. When cleaning, his work was always adequate, never so brilliant as to attract praise nor so slovenly as to warrant punishment. During his lessons, he would demonstrate competence, but not genius, answering questions correctly, but never volunteering an insight that might mark him as unusually ambitious. In his martial training, he would be proficient but not a prodigy. The goal was to blend into the background, to become a reliable but forgettable part of the institutional machinery. His movements became economical and quiet. He learned to walk the palace's marble corridors without making a sound, to anticipate the needs of a superior and fulfill them before a command was given, and then to melt away without awaiting acknowledgement. This cultivated invisibility was a direct response to the dangers of being noticed. A boy who was too clumsy or defiant was quickly broken by the Fa, but a boy who was too conspicuously talented or beautiful faced a different, more complex set of threats. Exceptional beauty could attract the unwanted and predatory attention of senior pages or even corrupt officials, drawing him into dangerous entanglements. Exceptional intellect could be perceived as a threat by his peers, making him a target for sabotages spilled in quell on a perfect piece of calligraphy, a misplaced book before an important examination. To reveal one's full capabilities prematurely was to play a winning hand too early, exposing oneself to the jealousy and paranoia that saturated the Enderun. Therefore, the ultimate act of self-control in an environment designed to strip it away. It was a conscious decision to defer ambition in the name of survival. It was a period of intense, silent learning where the page mastered the true curriculum of the palace, the unwritten rules of human power, cruelty, and desire. He learned that the walls had ears, that smiles could conceal daggers, and that silence was his most formidable armor. Only after he had fully mapped his prison and understood the nature of its keepers could he begin to contemplate the next, even more dangerous step, choosing the right moment and the right method to finally be seen. The state of strategic invisibility, however, was a temporary and inherently limited phase. It was a shield for the vulnerable, a necessary period of acclimatization, but it was not a power or even to long-term security. To remain a ghost forever was to risk being deemed useless, a placeholder to be swept aside when a new levy of boys arrived. Advancement within the Enderun required a carefully managed transition from being unseen to being unseen to being seen in precisely the right way, for precisely the right reason. The mechanism for this delicate maneuver was the cultivation and perfection of a specific, high-value talent. A specialized skill was more than a mere accomplishment. It was a shield of a different kind. It was a justification for one's existence, a tool that could deflect the jealousy of rivals and, most importantly, a legitimate pretext for being brought into the orbit of the Sultan. In a system populated by hundreds of physically beautiful and well-drilled young men, a unique talent was the only route to distinction. It allowed a page to transcend his status as an interchangeable object and become a specific, memorable individual. The choice of which talent to cultivate was, therefore, a matter of profound strategic importance, guided by the cultural values of the court and the specific tastes of the reigning sultan. The most esteemed skills were those that catered to the refined sensibilities of the ruler and enhanced the atmosphere of sophisticated leisure that he was expected to cultivate in his private hours. The preeminent talent, the one that carried the most prestige, was the art of poetry. In the Ottoman court, poetry was not a frivolous pastime. It was the highest form of cultural expression, the language of love, philosophy, and even statecraft. A page who could not only recite the classics of Persian and Ottoman verse, but also compose his own original poems, demonstrated an intellectual and aesthetic refinement that was highly prized. This skill was a powerful signal of his successful indoctrination into the high culture of the empire. It showed that he was more than a beautiful body. He was a mind that had been polished to a brilliant shine. The ability to engage in witty, poetic exchanges, to cap an other's verse with a clever line of one's own, or to compose a flattering ode to the Sultan's wisdom or military prowess, was a direct path to favor. It provided a legitimate reason for him to be in the Sultan's presence, not merely as an attendant, but as a stimulating intellectual companion. Equally valuable was a proficiency in music. The private life of the Sultan was frequently accompanied by a musical soundscape. A page with a beautiful singing voice or who had mastered a difficult instrument such as the soulful, fretless oud or the haunting, breathy tones of the ney flute possessed a direct key to the ruler's emotions. While poetry engaged the mind, music could soothe the spirit. It was a service of a more intimate and atmospheric kind. A talented musician could be summoned to the Sultan's private chambers to play for him as he relaxed, to accompany a meal, or to fill the quiet evening hours with pleasing melodies. This provided a level of proximity to the ruler that was otherwise almost impossible to achieve. It was an opportunity to be seen and heard in a context of pleasure and repose, far from the rigid formalities of the court. Beyond the high arts, The more subtle skill of conversation was a potent tool. This was not the ability to chatter, but the refined art of being an engaging, intelligent, and above all, discreet companion. It required a deep understanding of court politics, a knowledge of recent events, and the ability to tell a compelling story or offer a thoughtful observation. Crucially, it also demanded an intuitive sense of when to remain in supportive silence. A page who mastered this art could make himself indispensable as a confidant, a sounding board for a ruler burdened by the immense pressures of state. To be the person with whom the Sultan could speak freely, knowing that his words would never be repeated, was to occupy a position of extraordinary, albeit precarious, trust. The cultivation of these skills was a long and arduous process, undertaken with the same discipline that governed every other aspect of Enderun life. It required countless hours of solitary practice, of memorization, of trial and error. This effort was itself a performance. Tutors and eunuchs would take note of the page who stayed late in the library, or who spent his free moments quietly practicing a melody. This demonstrated ambition and diligence, qualities the system was designed to reward. When the skill was finally deemed perfect, it would be showcased, not by the page himself, but discovered by a superior who would then report it up the chain of command. The talent, therefore, served as a shield against accusations of idleness and a key, carefully forged, to unlock the doors that led from the anonymous crowd of the school to the singular, spotlighted stage of the Sultan's personal favor. While a refined talent provided a legitimate vector for advancement, it operated within the formal system of merit, a structure visible to unsanctioned by the eunuch masters. Parallel to this, and often more decisive, was a shadow economy that trafficked in a different, more volatile commodity information. In the hermetically sealed world of the Enderun, where material wealth was non-existent and formal authority was the sole province of the overseers, whispers became currency. Analyze and strategically deploy information was the ultimate clandestine art, a skill that could protect a page from his rivals, curry favor with his superiors, and ultimately determine his fate far more effectively than a perfectly recited poem or a flawlessly played melody. This information ecosystem was complex and multi-layered. At its most basic level, it involved the gathering of intelligence on one's peers. A page who learned that a rival had a secret fear of horses, for example, could use this knowledge to subtly engineer a situation where the rival would appear cowardly during equestrian training. Knowledge of another page's minor but punishable transgressions, a hoarded piece of fruit, a prohibited conversation in his native tongue, was a weapon to be held in reserve, a piece of leverage that could be used for blackmail or traded for a different piece of valuable information. This created an atmosphere of pervasive, low-grade paranoia where every page was simultaneously an intelligence agent and a target. True friendship was a dangerous luxury. Transcational alliances, based on the mutual exchange of useful secrets, were the more common and pragmatic form of relationship. The next, more valuable layer of intelligence concerned the eunuch overseers and tutors. These men held the power of immediate reward and punishment, and understanding their individual psychologies was a critical survival tool. The adept page learned to become a student of his master's personalities. He would discreetly observe which pages a particular eunuch seemed to favor and analyze the reasons why. He would take note of a tutor's pet peeves, his intellectual vanities, his unstated preferences. This information had immediate practical applications. Knowing that a certain overseer was a devout mystic might prompt a page to be seen reading a Sufi text. Knowing that a calligraphy master secretly despised a rival scholar could lead a page to subtly praise his master's work at the expense of the other. These were not acts of sincere flattery. They were calculated maneuvers, designed to create a subtle bond of favor and to position oneself as an astute and sympathetic subordinate. The most valuable and dangerous information of all, the pure gold of the palace's whisper economy, was any intelligence, no matter how trivial, related to the Sultan himself. The ruler's moods, his health, his passing fancies, his private frustrations, these were the secrets upon which fortunes could be built and lost. This information filtered down into the Enderun through a variety of channels. A senior page assigned to the Sultan's private chambers might mention that the ruler had slept poorly. A page serving in the palace kitchens might overhear that the Sultan had refused his favorite dish. A musician might note that a particular melody had seemed to displease him. Each of these fragments, meaningless in isolation, became a crucial piece of a larger puzzle. The page who could assemble these pieces gained a formidable advantage. If he knew the Sultan was in a melancholic mood, he might advise a fellow musician to play a somber piece of music, earning the gratitude and indebtedness of his peer. If he learned the Sultan had a newfound interest in geography, he could focus his studies on maps and exploration, preparing himself for a potential conversation that could catapult him into favor. The deployment of favor. To reveal that one knew a secret about the Sultan was to invite a fatal inquiry into how that secret was obtained. Information had to be laundered, its source obscured. It was best used not by stating it, but by acting upon it, allowing others to draw the desired conclusions. A page would not say, "The Sultan is interested in maps." He would simply be found studying a map at the opportune moment. Thus, the Enderun was not just a school of arts and letters, it was a school of espionage. The pages were being trained implicitly in the skills of a courtier, a diplomat, and a spy. They learned that knowledge was power, but that the appearance of knowledge was a liability. The most powerful player in this game was not the one who taught the most, but the one who listened most effectively. He cultivated a network of informants, traded in whispers as a merchant trades in silk, and built a mental archive of the secrets and weaknesses of every significant individual in his world. This carefully managed flow of information was his true shield and his sharpest, most hidden knife. After years spent in the crucible of the Enderun, mastering its formal curriculum and its clandestine codes of conduct, a page reached the final and most critical stage of his training. His entire existence, the initial capture, the erasure of his identity, the endless drills and etiquette in the arts had been a prelude to a single, decisive moment, his formal presentation to the Sultan. This was not a casual introduction. It was a highly ritualized and psychologically intense performance, a final examination where the sole judge held the power of life, death, and everything in between. The outcome of this brief encounter would determine whether the years of brutal preparation would culminate in a privilege or a descent into permanent, anonymous obscurity. The selection of a page for presentation was a strategic decision made at the highest levels of the palace administration, primarily by the copyaga. The choice was based on a confluence of factors. The page had to have reached a certain age, typically his late teens or early 20s, when his physical beauty was at its peak and his education was considered complete. He must have demonstrated flawless mastery of court protocol and excelled in his chosen element. His record of discipline had to be perfect. The copyaga would not risk his own standing by presenting the Sultan with a candidate who was anything less than the polished embodiment of the Enderun's ideals. The tastes and moods of the Sultan were the final, decisive variable. The chief eunuch was an expert in his master's psychology, and he would select a page whose specific type, his physical appearance, his artistic skill, his temperament was most likely to appeal to the ruler's current disposition. Once selected, the page underwent a final, intensive period of grooming. He was removed from the communal chambers and given more private quarters. His diet was carefully controlled to ensure his complexion was clear and his physique optimal. He was bathed, scented with expensive oils, and dressed in the finest garments. The palace could provide robes of silk brocade, a jewel turban, and a sash of gold-threaded cloth. This physical transformation was designed to be overwhelming, to present him not as a fellow human being, but as a perfect, almost supernatural object of beauty, an offering worthy of an emperor. During this period, he was coached relentlessly by senior eunuchs, who would drill him on the precise sequence of actions and words during the presentation. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of orchestrated power dynamics, designed to underscore between the Sultan and the page. It would typically take place in one of the Sultan's private pavilions within the third court, such as the famous tiled kiosk. The Sultan would be reclining on a low divan, surrounded by opulent cushions, the very picture of absolute relaxed authority. The copyaga would lead the page into the room and halt at a prescribed distance. The page was then required to perform the timena, the most profound gesture of respect in the Ottoman court. He would bow low, touch his right hand to the floor, then to his lips, and finally to his forehead, a symbolic gesture signifying that he was raising the dust from the Sultan's feet to his own heart and mind. He would repeat this 3 times, each movement executed with a slow, practiced grace. Throughout this, the page was forbidden from making direct eye contact with the Sultan, unless explicitly invited to do so. His gaze was to be fixed on the floor, a physical manifestation of his subservience. The copy aga would then announce the page's name and list his accomplishments, essentially presenting his resume to the ruler. At this point, the Sultan might gesture for the page to display his talent. If he was a musician, an instrument would be provided, and he would be expected to play a piece that was technically brilliant but emotionally reserved, demonstrating skill without presumption. If he was a poet, he would be asked to recite a verse, his voice clear and steady, betraying no hint of the terror that was undoubtedly coursing through him. The Sultan's role in this drama was one of almost complete passivity. He might listen, his face an unreadable mask, or he might dismiss the page with a flick of his wrist before the performance was even complete. He might ask a single simple question, testing the page's eloquence and wit. The entire encounter could last for minutes or mere seconds. The page was a supplicant, an object on display, and the Sultan was the connoisseur, the ultimate arbiter of his worth. At the conclusion of the presentation, the page would perform the tea minna once more, and then walk backwards out of the room, never turning his back on the source of all power. He would then be escorted back to his quarters to await the verdict, a period of agonizing uncertainty. The verdict would not come in words, but in the form of a gift, a summons, or a silence more damning than any spoken rejection. The period of waiting that followed the presentation was a unique form of psychological torture. The page was suspended between 2 potential realities, returned to a state of near invisibility, but now burdened with the agonizing weight of having been seen. He performed his duties in a fog of uncertainty, his every sense attenuated, listening for a footstep, a whisper. A silence from the Sultan's quarters was not an absence of information. It was a potent, crushing message of potential failure. Then, one evening, the silence would be broken. It would not be a shouted order or a casual message. The summons, when it came, was as ritualized and impersonal as every other aspect of his existence. A junior eunuch, his face a perfect blank, would approach him without a word. In his hands he would be carrying a specific object, perhaps a small, embroidered cloth, or a single, perfect flower. This token was the entire communication. There was no need for speech. Its meaning was absolute and understood by all. The page was to prepare himself. He was being called to the Sultan's private chambers, the Hazoda. The moment this token was presented, a new and final phase of preparation would begin. This time not for display, but for intimacy, an intimacy that was itself a form of imperial ceremony. He would be escorted by 2 eunuchs to a private bathhouse reserved for this purpose. Here, he was once again subjected to the ministrations of others, his body treated as an object to be perfected. He was scrubbed with rough cloths and scented soaps, his skin exfoliated until it was smooth and glowing. His remaining hair was attended to, and his body was anointed with precious, fragrant oils, musk, ambergris, or rose oil, the scent itself a marker of the extraordinary status of the occasion. He was then dressed in a new set of garments, even finer than those he wore for the presentation. These were clothes designed not for formal display in the light of day, but for comfort and aesthetic appeal in the softest silk, a loose-fitting chemise of fine linen, and an unadorned, elegant kaftan. The entire process was silent, methodical, and profoundly dehumanizing. He was being prepared not as a partner for an encounter, but as a consumable luxury, an artifact to be presented for the Sultan's pleasure. The journey from the preparatory rooms to the Hazoda was a passage through the very heart of power. The palace at night was a different world. The bustling activity of the day was replaced by a profound, watchful stillness. The corridors were lit only by flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows on the tiled walls. The page's soft-soled slippers made no sound on the marble floors. His only companions were the 2 eunuchs who walked before and behind him, their presence a silent, suffocating escort. They passed armed guards who stood as motionless as statues, their eyes acknowledging the eunuchs, but pointedly ignoring the page himself. He was a secret being moved through the arteries of the palace, his passage both momentous and entirely unaccompanied. This silent procession through the darkened heart of his gilded cage was the final, isolating step in his journey, stripping away the last vestiges of the communal life of the Enderun and thrusting him into the singular reality of the Sultan. Finally, they would arrive at the doors of the Hazoda, the chamber of the privy. This was the most sacred secular space in the entire empire. The air here was heavy with reverence and fear. The doors, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and tortoisile, were guarded by the most elite of the palace eunuchs. At a silent signal from the escorts, the guards would open the doors just enough for the page to slip through, and then close them again with a soft but definitive click. The sound of the lock engaging was the sound of his last connection to the outside world being severed. He was now in a room of overwhelming sensory richness. The air was thick with the scent of burning aloes wood. The only light came from a few strategically placed lanterns, creating a dim, intimate atmosphere where pools of light fell upon impossibly rich textiles, velvet cushions, silk carpets, and heavy brocade wall hangings. The room was a treasure box, but it was also a space of profound and suffocating quiet. The Sultan was there, reclining on a raised divan, a figure of absolute stillness. As he had been drilled to do, performed his prostration, lowering himself to the floor in a gesture of complete submission. And then he waited, motionless on the carpet, his head bowed. He waited in a silence that was more absolute than any he had ever experienced. The years of training, the pain, the ambition, the terror, it had all led to this. He was alone with the master of his universe, a man who held his past, present, and future in the palm of his hand. Calculated performance of becoming was over. The unscripted reality of being the Sultan's favorite was about to begin. The night spent in the Sultan's chamber was a crossing of the Rubicon, an event from which there was no return to a former state of being. The page who emerged in the pale light of dawn was a fundamentally different creature from the one who had entered in the dark. His status, his material reality, and his relationship with every other inhabitant of the palace had been irrevocably transformed. The events that transpired within the Hazoda were, by their very nature, a secret held between the individuals. But the consequences of that secret were immediately and publicly visible. The morning after was a formal and tangible ledger, a public accounting of the Sultan's favor, designed to announce the creation of a new favorite, or goes the one in the eye. The first and most immediate sign of this new status was the ceremonial bestowal of gifts. As the page prepared to leave the Sultan's chamber, he would be presented with a series of objects, their value and nature carefully calibrated to signify the degree of the Sultan's pleasure. The most common and potent of these was the robe of honor, the hilat. This was a garment, often a kaftan, that had been either worn by the Sultan himself or came from his personal wardrobe. To be given a hilat was a profound honor, a symbolic act of being covered by the Sultan's own grace and protection. It was a visible mark of favor that the page would wear as he departed, a silent, irrefutable announcement to all who saw him of what had transpired. Along with the robe of honor, he would receive a purse filled with gold coins, an amount far exceeding any stipend he might have received as a page. This was not a wage, it was an imperial gift, a sign of the Sultan's largesse. It represented the page's transition from a state of complete material dependence on the institution to one of personal, albeit derived, wealth. He might also be gifted a fine horse from the imperial stables, a jeweled dagger, or other personal items from the Sultan's own collection. Each gift was a tangible data point, its quality and quantity immediately assessed and catalogued by the court's ever-watchful eyes. Upon returning to the Enderun, the page's life would be immediately and drastically altered. He would be removed from the communal dormitories of his former chamber. The eunuch administrators, acting on orders that had been dispatched while he was still in the Sultan's presence, would have already prepared a new, private apartment for him within the palace. This space, known as a dare, would be opulently furnished with carpets, cushions, and fine decorations. For the first time since his capture, he would have a measure of privacy, a space of his own, a luxury that was in itself a supreme symbol of his elevated rank. With this new private quarter came a new staff. He was no longer just a page, he was a master. He would be assigned several junior pages to act as his personal attendants. These were boys just like he had been who were now tasked with serving him, bringing his meals, preparing his clothes, and attending to his every need. This reversal of roles was a powerful and public demonstration of his ascent up the palace hierarchy. He was now a participant in the system of dominance that had once completely subjugated him. To be served by those who were once his peers was a constant, intoxicating reminder of his new power. The change was also reflected in his daily routine. He was largely excused from the rote duties and collective lessons of the Enderun. His time was now his own, to be filled with the refinement of his artistic talents, with reading, or with quiet leisure, or in anticipation of the next summons from the Sultan. His access to the palace's resources was now virtually unlimited. He could request the finest materials for his calligraphy, the most learned tutors for private instruction, or the most exquisite ingredients for his meals. The entire machinery of the palace, which had once been geared toward his subjugation, was now reoriented to cater to his comfort and pleasure. This sudden, dramatic elevation was a calculated act of state theater. It was designed to be seen, to be envied, and to be feared. The sight of the new favorite, dressed in his robe of honor, followed by his own retinue of servants, moving into his private apartment, was a powerful message to every other page in the Enderun. It was the ultimate validation of their brutal training, the living proof that the seemingly impossible prize was, for a select few, attainable. It stoked the fires of ambition in the hearts of the younger pages, reinforcing the logic of the system. But for those who were his direct peers and rivals, this public ledger of his success was not an inspiration. It was a declaration of war. The opulence of the new favorite's life, so publicly displayed, was a double-edged sword. While it was a testament to the Sultan's pleasure, it was also a magnet for the most dangerous and corrosive force within the palace walls, the jealousy of his peers. The congratulations he received from the other pages were a masterclass in dissimulation. The smiles were perfectly formed, the words of praise impeccably chosen, but their eyes held a cold, calculating light that he, a recent graduate of the same school of survival, could read with perfect clarity. He had just won the only prize that mattered, and in doing so had rendered their own ambitions exponentially more difficult to achieve. His victory was their defeat. The moment he donned the robe of honor, he ceased to be a comrade and became a target. The jealousy this engendered was not merely emotional but deeply structural. The Sultan's favor was a finite resource, a single brilliant spotlight on a crowded and darkened stage. By stepping into that light, the new Gate had cast a shadow over all the others. Every gift he received, every moment he spent in the Sultan's company, was a resource denied to them. He was a resource denied to them. He was a living obstruction in their path to power. This reality transformed the subtle, competitive environment of the Enderun into a silent, lethal battlefield with him as the sole objective. The threat, however, would not come in the form of an open challenge. Such an act would be suicidal. Instead, it would manifest as a campaign of insidious, deniable sabotage, a war fought with whispers, accidents, and carefully placed drops of poison. The first line of attack was aimed at his performance, his ability to please the Sultan. The very talents that had secured his position now became his greatest vulnerabilities. If he was a musician, he might find that the strings of his oud had been subtly frayed, designed to snap at the most inopportune moment during a private performance. If he was a poet, a precious manuscript he had been studying, a source of inspiration for a new verse, might mysteriously disappear from his chambers. These were small, frustrating acts of attrition designed to make him appear clumsy, unprepared, or less talented than the Sultan had been led to believe. The goal was to sow the first seeds of doubt in the ruler's mind, to tarnish the perfection that had won him favor. Parallel to this was a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. Rumors, the lifeblood of the court, would be deployed with surgical precision. A whisper might be started that he secretly harbored sympathies for a rival political faction, or that he had spoken dismissively of a high-ranking official. The most effective calumny often pertained to his health, a subtle suggestion that he was suffering from a hidden, debilitating illness that made him unclean or unfit for the Sultan's company. These were lies designed to grow in the dark, impossible to refute because their source was always anonymous. The favorite would sense a change in the atmosphere, a new coolness in a eunuch's demeanor without ever knowing the specific poison that had been dripped into their ear. The most immediate and terrifying threat, however, was to his physical person. His new, private quarters, which at first seemed a symbol of luxury, quickly revealed themselves to be a place of profound isolation and vulnerability. Every meal became a source of acute anxiety. Poison was the courtier's weapon of choice, silent, often untraceable, and devastatingly effective. The favorite quickly learned never to eat a dish that had not first been sampled by a trusted personal attendant, a food taster whose own life was a shield for his master's. This precaution, while necessary, was a constant, grim reminder that the very sustenance he needed to live could be the instrument of his death. Beyond poison, the threat of a staged accident was ever present. A polished marble floor could be made slick with a few drops of oil. The girth on his saddle could be loosened just enough to cause a serious fall during a ride in the palace grounds. A heavy tapestry could become detached from its wall mounting as he passed beneath it. None of these events, should they occur, could be definitively proven as malicious. They would be dismissed as unfortunate mishaps. This created a state of perpetual hypervigilance, where the favorite had to constantly assess his environment for hidden dangers, trusting no one and nothing. The smile of a former friend was now a mask for a potential assassin. A helping hand could be the one that guided him toward a fatal misstep. The price of the Sultan's favor was the loss of all peace of mind. It was the understanding that in the gilded cage, the most dangerous predators were not the keepers, but the other captive. While the horizontal threat from jealous rivals was immediate and visceral, a far greater and more complex danger emanated from a source of power that was vertical, looming over the entire court, including the Sultan himself. This was the domain of the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. As the mother of the reigning Sultan, she held a unique and constitutional authority. She was the matriarch of the dynasty, the head of the imperial harem, and often the most influential political advisor to her son. For a new favorite, navigating a relationship with this formidable woman was the ultimate high-wire act. To earn her favor was to gain the most powerful ally imaginable. To incur her displeasure was to sign one's own death warrant. The Valide Sultan's power base was the imperial harem, the sequestered world of the palace's women. This was a parallel universe to the Enderun, with its own complex hierarchies, its own eunuch administrators, the Black Eunuchs, and its own political agenda. The Queen Mother presided over this world as an absolute monarch. From her opulent apartments, she controlled a vast network of information, patronage, and influence that extended into every corner of the empire. The Sultan's other consorts, and the legion of female slaves and servants were her eyes and ears, gathering intelligence that often surpassed that of the Grand Vizier. Her primary political objective was singular and unwavering: to protect the life and power of her son, and by extension her own. Any individual who gained intimate access to the Sultan was, by definition, a variable that the Valide Sultan had to assess and control. A new male favorite was no exception. He was an outsider, a potential vector for unwelcome influence, and a competitor for her son's attention and affection. From the moment he was chosen, he was placed under her intense and unrelenting scrutiny. She would use her network to compile a complete dossier on him: his origins, his temperament, most importantly his potential loyalties and weaknesses. The favorite would be acutely aware of this surveillance, sensing her unseen gaze in the questions asked by a seemingly innocuous palace servant or in the sudden attentiveness of a harem eunuch. The favorite's first and most critical task was to demonstrate his absolute and unconditional loyalty, not just to the Sultan but to her. He had to make it clear that he understood the true locus of familial power and that he had no intention of challenging it. This was achieved through a series of carefully orchestrated performances of deference. When in a setting where he might encounter her, he would perform the most profound obeisance. He would seek opportunities to send her a small, respectful gift. Most importantly, he would use his private access to the Sultan to subtly reinforce her own political positions. If he knew, through the palace's whisper network, that the Valide Sultan favored a particular candidate for a governorship, he might find a way to praise the candidate's qualifications in a quiet conversation with the ruler. He had to become her instrument, a loyal agent within her son's most private circle. However, even this was a perilous game. If his advocacy on her behalf was too obvious, the Sultan, who often had a complex and psychologically charged relationship with his powerful mother, might resent the manipulation and turn against him for being her puppet. He had to walk a razor's edge, promoting her agenda so subtly that it appeared to be his own organic counsel, or better yet, the Sultan's own idea. This required an almost preternatural degree of emotional intelligence and political acumen. The consequences of failing to secure the valid Sultan's approval were dire. If she perceived the favorite as a threat, as someone who was isolating her son, filling his head with dangerous ideas, or simply consuming too much of his emotional energy, she had a vast arsenal of weapons at her disposal. She could begin a campaign of slander against him, whispering doubts about his loyalty, or poison administered by the one voice the ruler was conditioned from birth to trust. She could use her influence over the harem to create political problems for the Sultan that would be implicitly blamed on the distraction caused by his new infatuation. In the most extreme cases, if she deemed him a true danger to the stability of the throne or her own position, she could arrange for his permanent removal. Her authority, particularly over the black eunuchs who controlled the harem, was absolute. An order from her to dispose of a disgraced favorite would be carried out swiftly and without question. A poison cup, a staged accident, the silent application of a silk cord in his private chambers, these were all tools available to her. The favorite understood this reality in his very bones. The Sultan's affection was his shield against the daggers of his rivals, but only the valid Sultan's calculated tolerance could protect him from the executioner's bowstring. The intricate political maneuvering required to survive the attentions of the valid Sultan in the silent animosity of rivals was a constant mental strain. Yet, this was only one dimension of the favorite's new, precarious existence. The source of his elevation, the very foundation upon which his fragile status was built, was his physical self. His body, once the subject of a single, decisive inspection, now became an object of continuous, invasive, and institutionalized scrutiny. It was no longer his own private concern. It was recontextualized as an imperial asset, a valuable and delicate instrument of state, whose preservation was a matter of administrative importance. The health and beauty of the favorite were now subject to the same rigorous management as the imperial treasury or the palace armories. This new reality was personified by the Hikimbies, the chief physician, and his team of imperial doctors. These were the most skilled medical practitioners in the empire, men of immense learning and status. However, their relationship with the favorite was not that of a compassionate healer to a priceless. It was that of a specialist curator to a priceless, but perishable work of art. The favorite was placed on a strict and non-negotiable medical regimen, detailed physical examinations. These were not conducted in response to any complaint of illness, but were a proactive measure of quality. He would be inspected by the physicians, who would note any change in his weight, muscle tone, or skin complexion. Every part of his body was subject to their professional, dispassionate gaze. Based on these examinations, the physicians would prescribe a meticulously controlled diet. The favorite's meals were no longer a matter of personal taste. The imperial kitchens would receive daily instructions from the medical staff, detailing the precise ingredients and preparation methods for his food. Certain dishes would be prescribed to enhance the luster of his hair, others to ensure the clarity of his eyes or the smoothness of his skin. Foods deemed to be coarsening or likely to cause blemishes were strictly forbidden. His diet was a form of preventative medicine, designed not simply to maintain his health, but to actively manage his aesthetic appeal. Every meal was a calculated intervention, a tool to preserve the specific physical qualities that had pleased the Sultan. His physical activity was similarly regulated. While he was exempt from the communal drills of the Enderun, he was not permitted a life of indolence. The physicians would prescribe a specific regimen of exercise designed to maintain the youthful silhouette and graceful bearing that were essential to his role. This might involve a set period of horsemanship in a private riding ground, practice with the bow to maintain posture and upper body strength, or even specific forms of wrestling designed to promote upperness without building unsightly bulk. These activities were monitored, his performance noted and reported. His body was to be kept in a state of perfect readiness, an instrument honed for the Sultan's pleasure. This constant surveillance of his physical form created a profound and corrosive anxiety. The favorite's value was inextricably linked to his transient, biological reality. The first sign of physical imperfection, a minor skin rash, a persistent cough, the faintest of lines appearing at the corners of his eyes, was not a personal health concern, but a professional crisis. It was a potential depreciation of his core value, a flaw in the imperial asset. He learned to live in a state of constant self-monitoring, becoming hyper-aware of his own body, seeing it not as the vessel of his consciousness, but through the critical eyes of his keepers. If he were to fall genuinely ill, he would be immediately isolated. This quarantine was not just to prevent the spread of disease, it was to remove an imperfect object from the Sultan's sight. The medical care he received would be the best available, but its motivation was starkly pragmatic. The physicians worked to repair the asset. If the illness was brief and left no mark, he might be restored to his position. But a prolonged sickness, or one that left any permanent scar or blemish, was a fatal blow to his career. The system had no place for a damaged commodity. He would not be formally punished, but the Sultan's summons would cease. The gifts would stop. He would be quietly removed from his private apartment and relegated to a state of liminal obscurity within the palace, a living ghost, a constant and terrifying reminder to all the others of the brutal equation that governed their lives. Beauty was power, and its loss was a form of death. As the favorite's position solidified, his relationship with the Sultan would often evolve beyond the purely physical and aesthetic. The long hours spent in the private chambers, the quiet intimacy of the post-midnight world, could create a space for a different kind of service. The Sultan, for all his absolute power, was arguably the most isolated man in the empire. He was surrounded by a court of petitioners, ministers, and relatives, every one of whom had a personal agenda. Every conversation was a transaction, every word weighed for its political implication. The formality of his position was a cage as real as any in the palace. In this profound solitude, the favorite, an individual with no family, no land, and no power base of his own, could become a unique and tempting outlet to confidant. This transition from a purveyor of pleasure to a repository of confidences was the most dangerous promotion of all. In moments of exhaustion, frustration, or reflection, the Sultan might begin to speak his mind. He might voice his suspicions about the loyalty of a distant governor, express his disappointment with the Grand Vizier's handling of a state matter, or share his strategic anxieties before a major military moment of personal weakness, a flicker of fear or doubt, a human frailty that could never be shown to the formal court. The favorite's role in these moments was one of absolute, receptive silence. He was not an advisor, he was a vessel. His function was to listen, to absorb, and to forget. He was expected to be a living vault, a human diary whose pages would be sealed by an unspoken oath of absolute discretion. To be the keeper of such secrets was to be initiated into the true, dark heart of imperial power. The favorite was now privy to information that could destroy the most powerful men in the empire. He knew of the Sultan's hidden intentions, his secret judgments, and his lethal paranoia. This knowledge was a form of power, but it was a volatile, radioactive power that was infinitely more likely to destroy its holder than to serve him. A man whose death could solve a great many potential problems for a great many important people. The burden of this knowledge was twofold. First, it placed him in a position of extreme personal danger. If a secret he was ever leaked, he would be the first and most logical suspect. An accusation of treason, whether true or not, would be impossible to refute. His proximity to the Sultan was both his greatest protection and his most damning piece of circumstantial evidence. A single misstep, a careless word by the wrong person, could lead directly to the silk cord. Second, and more insidiously, his status as the Sultan's confidant made him a primary target for the court's political factions. The Grand Vizier, the chief jurists, the generals of the Janissaries, all the great lords of the empire would immediately recognize that a new, unofficial channel of influence to the Sultan had just opened. They would begin to court him, to cultivate him as an asset. This would not come in the form of overt bribes or threats. It would be a campaign of subtle seduction. He would be shown unusual deference by powerful men, receive unexpected and valuable gifts, be invited into conversations far above his station. Their goal was twofold: to extract information about the Sultan's true moods and intentions, and to persuade the favorite to whisper a favorable word on their behalf during his private hours with the ruler. This placed the favorite in an impossible, unwinnable position. To accept the overtures of a powerful minister was to become his pawn, a treacherous act that, if ever discovered by the Sultan, would mean an immediate and excruciating death. Yet to rebuff a man like the Grand Vizier, to refuse his friendship, was to make a mortal enemy of the second most powerful man in the empire, an enemy who had 1,000 ways to arrange his downfall. He had to learn a new and even more difficult art, the art of perfect, smiling, and utterly non-committal neutrality. He had to accept the gifts with profound gratitude, but without any implied promise. He had to listen to the minister's self-serving arguments with deep attention but commit to nothing. He had to exist at the very center of the empire's web of intrigue while pretending to be completely unaware of its strands. The psychological toll of this constant performance, of balancing the paranoid trust of the Sultan against the predatory ambitions of his court, was immense. The secrets he carried were a poison that corroded his peace of mind, isolating him more completely than the palace walls ever could. The role of confidant, fraught as it was with the peril of holding state secrets, was merely the antechamber to a deeper, more psychologically consuming form of service. The Sultan, in his profound isolation, did not merely seek a discreet ear for his political anxieties. He sought an emotional sanctuary, a space where the crushing weight of his divine authority could be momentarily set aside. He sought the illusion of a human connection, of intimacy. It fell to the favorite to provide this illusion. His final and most difficult task was to transcend the role of a beautiful object or a clever servant and become a flawless actor in a command performance of affection, a one-man play staged for an audience of one, where the penalty for a single missed cue was oblivion. This performance was the most demanding of his life, requiring a constant and exhausting emotional labor. It was not enough to be a passive listener. He had to become an active participant in the Sultan's inner life. He learned to read the subtle topography of the ruler's moods, the slight downturn of his lips that signaled a day of frustration in the imperial council, the restless drumming of his fingers that betrayed anxiety over distant military news. His role was to anticipate these emotional states and provide the appropriate response. He had to be a mirror, reflecting a perfected, soothing version of what the Sultan needed to feel. He offered the warm, unquestioning smile after a triumph, the soft, sympathetic touch after a setback, the shared, indignant anger at the treachery of an enemy. He learned to laugh at the Sultan's jokes with a warmth that felt spontaneous and to listen to his recitations of poetry with an expression of rapt, sincere admiration. Every gesture, every word, every glance was a carefully calibrated component of this elaborate performance of devotion. The intimacy was constructed from 1,000 meticulously executed details. The way he would adjust a cushion behind the Sultan's back without being asked, the way his gaze would linger with apparent fondness when he thought he was not being watched, the way he would bring a cup of sherbet with a quiet, attentive grace that suggested personal care rather than dutiful service. These were the constituent elements of the illusion designed to create a sense of genuine, selfless affection. He was portraying a character, the one person in the universe who desired nothing from the Sultan, who was there not because of his power, but because of the man himself. It was a fiction of staggering audacity, maintained under the most intense and continuous scrutiny. The psychological torment of this act was profound. It required a complete and sustained suppression of the self. The favorite's own feelings, his fear, his ambition, his loneliness, his resentment had to be buried so deeply that they never betrayed themselves in a flicker of an eye or a moment of hesitation. He lived in a state of cognitive dissonance, his outward actions in constant, violent contradiction to his internal reality. Over time, this could lead to a catastrophic erosion of his own identity. The mask of devotion worn for so long threatened to fuse with the face beneath. He might find himself unsure where the performance ended and he began. Did he truly feel a pang of sympathy for this lonely, powerful man? Or was that feeling simply a more sophisticated, more convincing part of the act, a survival mechanism masquerading as empathy? The power imbalance was so absolute that it rendered the very concept of genuine emotion a philosophical impossibility. Yet his life depended on providing a perfect facsimile of it on demand. The Sultan, for his part, may well have believed the performance to be real. Desperate for a connection and tainted by the sycophancy and ambition of his court, he may have seen in the favorite a unique and genuine soulmate. This belief, tragically, only made the favorite's position more perilous. It raised the stakes of the performance to an unbearable height. A moment of emotional exhaustion, a poorly feigned smile, a response that seemed distracted or insincere could be interpreted by the Sultan not as a simple human lapse, but as the most devastating of betrayals. It would be a confirmation of his deepest fear that he too was unlovable, and that even in his most private moments, he was still being manipulated. The favorite was thus trapped. He was a prisoner in an invisible cage built from the Sultan's need for love, a love he could never genuinely return because the very structure of their relationship, master and slave, made authenticity a fatal risk. His life depended on the successful maintenance of an illusion that he could never allow himself to believe in. The ecosystem of the Ottoman court, like any natural environment, was governed by cycles. Favor, for all its dazzling brilliance, was not a fixed star, but a season. It had a spring of intoxicating discovery, a summer of established intimacy, and an autumn of comfortable familiarity. But winter was always coming. For the favorite, the most terrifying aspect of his existence was the unspoken but universally understood truth that his position was inherently temporary. The fading of the light was not a possibility, it was a certainty. The only questions were when it would begin and how he would recognize its subtle, chilling dawn. The signs of the Sultan's waning interest weren't ever overt. There was no formal announcement, no sudden dismissal. Such a direct act would be unseemly, a disruption to the placid, elegant surface of court life. Instead, the fall from grace was a study in entropy, a slow, chilling audit of affection conducted through 1,000 tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior. The first indicator was a change in rhythm, which had once been a predictable and reassuring constant, would become slightly less frequent. A night would be missed, then two. Excuses would be offered through a third party. The Sultan was fatigued. He was occupied with late-night state papers, but the favorite, an expert in the nuances of this world, understood that these were mere courtesies, a thin veil over a cooling heart. When the summons did come, the quality of the time spent together would be different. The long, rambling conversations that had once stretched until dawn would be cut short. The Sultan's attention would seem to wander. His gaze, which had once been a focused, all-consuming force, would now drift towards the window or to a book left open on a nearby table. Shared laughter that had once filled the chamber would be replaced by a strained silence that the favorite would feel compelled to fill with increasingly desperate attempts at wit or music, his efforts landing in a deadening void. The intimate secrets, the whispers of political anxiety and personal doubt, would cease altogether. The Sultan was retreating, pulling his inner world back within himself, closing a door that had once been open. This emotional distancing was accompanied by subtle shifts in the public performance of favor. A gift would be given, but it would be a standard item from the treasury, lacking the personal touch of a previous offering. The Sultan might praise the favorite's poetry in the presence of others, but the words would be formulaic, lacking the specific, insightful compliments that had once marked his genuine admiration. The most brutal sign, however, was the mention of another. The Sultan might casually remark on the promising skill of a new page he had observed in the training grounds, or comment on the pleasing voice of a boy who had recited the Quran at the afternoon prayer. To the favorite, each such remark was the tolling of a bell, a signal that his master's either GOZ that had made him a GOZD was beginning to rove, searching for novelty, for a new surface upon which to project his desires. The favorite's reaction to these signs was a desperate, silent panic. He would redouble his efforts, his performance of affection becoming almost feverish in its intensity. His music would become more technically brilliant, his conversation more relentlessly charming, his attentiveness more suffocating. But this rarely worked. His desperation was palpable, and it was the very antithesis of the effortless grace and beauty that had first attracted the Sultan. His attempts to cling to favor only served to accelerate its departure, his fear making him tiresome. He would lie awake in his opulent, lonely apartment, endlessly replaying every recent interaction, searching for the moment the fracture occurred. What had he done wrong? What word had he misspoken? The true unbearable answer was that he had likely done nothing wrong. His only crime was familiarity. The passage of time itself had eroded his value. He was no longer a discovery, he was a possession. The Sultan, a man with the power to have anything he wanted, was simply growing bored. A finely tuned barometer of imperial favor would register the change before he was willing to admit it to himself. The bows of the vizieress would become fractionally less deep. The smiles of the eunuchs would no longer reach their eyes. His rivals in the Enderun, who had long been forced to mask their jealousy with deference, would begin to test the waters, their whispers growing bolder, their deference tinged with a new, subtle insolence. He was still the favorite, but the title was becoming hollow, an echo of a power that was already gone. The abstract fear of replacement, a ghost that had haunted his sleepless nights, was soon given a face and a name. The institutional process of supplanting a favorite was as methodical and impersonal as the process of his creation. It began not with a confrontation, but with an introduction. One day, in a palace garden or during a formal gathering, the copy aga would, with an air of calculated casualness, present a new senior page to the Sultan. The current favorite, standing in his accustomed place at the ruler's side, would be forced to watch the scene unfold, a spectator at the premiere of his own irrelevance. He saw in the boy's flawless features not a rival to be defeated, but a biological inevitability, a newer edition of himself. Possessing the one quality, he had irrevocably lost novelty. This new page would embody the very attributes that had first brought the favorite to prominence, but with the added, intoxicating allure of freshness. He was the unread book, the unheard melody. The favorite would observe with a cold, sickening sense of recognition the subtle but unmistakable signs of the Sultan's awakening interest. A gaze that lingered a second too long, a question directed to the new boy that was more personal than protocol required, genuine smile that the favorite had not seen on the Sultan's face for months. This carefully staged encounter was the formal beginning of the transfer of power. The court, with its finely honed instincts for the shifts in the political climate, would register it instantly. The room's center of gravity had begun to shift. The second stage of this process was the systematic promotion of the new candidate. The palace machinery, which had for so long been dedicated to maintaining the favorite's position, would now be asked to build up his successor. The new page's talents, which had been quietly nurtured in the Enderun, would now be given a public platform. He would be discovered, tutors would rave about his intellect, music masters would praise the emotive quality of his playing. He would be given prominent roles in court ceremonies, opportunities to display his grace and skill before the entire palace elite. The current favorite was forced to witness this, and often to participate in it. He would be asked by the Sultan for his opinion of the new prodigy, a cruel test of his composure. He had to praise the new boy's talents with a convincing sincerity to applaud his own replacement, effectively collaborating in his own demise. To show any hint of jealousy would be to reveal a grasping and dignified nature, a final flaw that would justify the Sultan's cooling affections. This public elevation of the new star was mirrored by the private allocation of resources. The finest silks would be diverted to the new page's tailor. The most skilled chefs would be consulted on his dietary preferences. The most learned tutors would be assigned to his private instruction. The favorite would notice these small changes, the subtle downgrading of the quality of his own life, 1,000 tiny administrative cuts that signaled his declining stock. The final, most humiliating stage was the direct juxtaposition. The Sultan might summon both the old favorite and the new to his private chambers for an evening of entertainment. This was the ultimate act of psychological cruelty. The two men would be made to perform one after the other. The favorite, his heart now burdened by a desperate anxiety, would be followed by the new page, whose performance was imbued with the effortless confidence of the ascendant. The Sultan's praise for the new page would be effusive and specific, while his thanks to the old would be polite, distant, and tinged with a faint, dismissive nostalgia. In these moments, he was not just being replaced. He was being rendered obsolete in real time, forced to serve as the drab, familiar backdrop against which the new brilliance could shine most brightly. The transfer was now complete. The nightly summons would now go to a different apartment. The embroidered token would be carried by the eunuch past his door. The silence that he had once dreaded as a sign of falling out of favor was now a permanent condition. He had been a Gozidi, the one in the eye. Now the eye had turned, and he was once again in the shadows, but this time there was no hope of being seen again. The state of a disgraced favorite was one of suspended animation, a liminal existence in the palace's forgotten corners. But this was an inherently unstable condition. The Ottoman court, a machine of exquisite order, did not tolerate loose ends. A former favorite was a living repository of the Sultan's most intimate secrets and a walking monument to his past affections. His continued presence was an administrative antidonus, a potential source of embarrassment, and, in the paranoid calculus of the court, a latent political threat. Therefore, the system had developed a repertoire of quiet, deniable methods for the final disposal of an asset that had outlived its usefulness. These were not acts of public justice, but discreet procedures of erasure, performed with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a potentially malignant growth. For the favorite who had become a simple inconvenience, whose fall from grace was straightforward and uncomplicated by deep political entanglements, a more direct and final solution was often employed. It would arrive not with a guard's sword but on a silver tray. Poison was the preferred instrument for a clean and unambiguous removal. The execution would be framed as an act of final, perfunctory kindness. A special meal, perhaps featuring a dish he was once known to enjoy, would be sent to his now modest quarters from the imperial kitchens. Or, more commonly, the agent would be introduced into his evening cup of wine or sherbet. The poisons used were sophisticated, often sourced from the furthest reaches of the empire, and selected for their ability to mimic the symptoms of a sudden, natural illness. The symptoms, when they began, were sudden and severe, recorded by the chief physician as a virulent, unidentifiable fever or a catastrophic failure of the digestive system. The doctors would be summoned, and a great show of attempting to save him would be made, their frantic but ultimately futile efforts serving as a piece of state theatre for the benefit of the palace record. The death, when it came, would be officially lamented as a tragic loss of a promising young man to a sudden malady. His body would be quickly and quietly washed, shrouded, and buried in an unmarked grave in a distant cemetery. The official narrative was seamless and unassailable. There was no crime, only a tragedy. There was no execution, only the will of God. The method was brutally efficient, achieving its objective with a minimum of administrative disruption and an absolute preservation of deniability. However, for a favorite of longer standing, one who was the repository of a dangerous quantity of state secrets, or one for whom the Sultan still harbored a troublesome residue of affection, a cruder method like poison was deemed too risky or too emotionally difficult. His sudden death might raise awkward questions. For such a case, a more subtle and psychologically refined solution was required. This was a death of a different kind, a complete social and mental annihilation, carried out within a gilded prison. The disgraced favorite would be informed that, for his own protection, he was being moved to a new, secure set of apartments. These rooms were often in a remote and isolated wing of the vast palace complex, sometimes in one of the older, less used kiosks. These quarters were not a dungeon. They were oft uncomfortably, even opulently, furnished with fine carpets, cushions, and objects d'art. But they were inescapable. The windows were barred with elegant but unbreakable lattice work. The single door was made of reinforced wood and was always locked from the outside. His every need was catered to, but his human contact was severed with surgical precision. He was attended by a small, dedicated staff of servants who were either deaf-mutes or had taken a vow of absolute silence in his presence. He saw no one else. He spoke to no one. His days were a monotonous cycle of silent meals, solitary pacing, and the slow, inexorable erosion of his sanity. This was not merely imprisonment, it was a deliberate and calculated psychological dismantling. The silence, broken only by the footfalls of a silent servant, became the primary instrument of his dissolution. The human mind, starved of stimulus, conversation, and purpose, would begin to collapse inward. He would descend through stages of profound depression into paranoia, hallucination, and eventually a complete break from reality. This eventual madness was not an unfortunate side effect of his confinement, it was the intended therapeutic outcome for the state. It neutralized him as a credible witness to any secrets he might hold, and it provided a convenient, post-hoc justification for his removal. The official story would be that his grief and disappointment over losing the Sultan's favor had, tragically, unhinged his mind, whether by a fast-acting toxin or the slow poison of isolation. The result was the same: the neat and tidy removal of a problematic human variable from the imperial equation, leaving behind only a cautionary tale and an undisturbed, placid surface. While poison and confinement served to erase the politically inconvenient, a different protocol was reserved for those whose status, even in disgrace, was too high to be dismissed with a mere fabricated illness or a quiet descent into madness. This category included favorites who had become deeply enmeshed in state-level intrigue, who had commanded the loyalty of a political faction, or who, by the sheer length and depth of their intimacy with the Sultan, had attained a quasi-dynastic stature. For such an individual, a simple, deniable death was insufficient. His removal had to be a formal, albeit secret, act of state. The instrument for this act was not a blade or a toxin, but a simple length of woven fiber, the silk cord. The spectre of this specific method of execution was the automaton, most chilling symbol of the automaton, most chilling symbol of the Ottoman system's unique blend of absolute power and ritualized reverence. The use of the silk cord was not an arbitrary cruelty. It was a deeply symbolic act rooted in the pre-Islamic traditions of the Turkic and Mongol peoples from whom the Ottomans descended. In these ancient steppe cultures, a profound taboo surrounded the shedding of royal or noble blood. The blood was believed to contain the soul and the divine charisma, or cut, that legitimized a ruler's line. To spill the blood of a person of high birth upon the earth was to commit a sacrilege, an act that could invite cosmic retribution, famine, and disaster upon the land and its people. Therefore, when the execution of a prince or a powerful chieftain was deemed necessary, a bloodless method was required. Strangulation, often with a bowstring, was the traditional solution. It was an act of violence that nonetheless preserved the sanctity of the victim's blood, respecting the divine essence of his lineage even at the moment of his annihilation. The Ottoman dynasty, even after its full embrace of Sunni Islam, retained this ancient, almost superstitious reverence for its own bloodline. This tradition was codified into a grim political reality. The execution of a prince to prevent a succession crisis, a practice tragically common in Ottoman history, was always carried out by strangulation. This principle was extended to those who, while not of royal blood themselves, had achieved a status so intimate and elevated that they were considered part of the Sultan's extended household. His quasi-family, a disgraced Grand Vizier who had once held the Sultan's seal, or a favorite who had been the ruler's most trusted confidant for years, had achieved a rank that made a common execution by beheading unthinkable. To put such a man to the sword would be to diminish the stature of the Sultan himself, by implying that an individual who had once been so close to the throne was no different from a common criminal. The execution by silk cord was therefore a paradox, an act of supreme honor conferred at the moment of death. The agents of this final act were a specialized and terrifying corps within the palace staff, the Boston CS, or imperial gardeners. While their public duties involved tending the palace grounds, their elite members also served executioners. Often, for missions of the highest sensitivity, a team of deaf mutes, known as DILSIZ, would be employed. These men were the perfect instruments of clandestine state violence. They could not hear their victims' pleas for mercy or any last-minute confessions of state secrets. More importantly, they could never speak of what they had done. They were living, breathing extensions of the Sultan's will, their silence ensuring the absolute secrecy of their work. The procedure itself was a grim and silent ritual. The executioners would arrive at the victim's quarters, typically in the dead of night. They would present him with the imperial death sentence. There was no trial, no appeal. The sentence was final. They would then produce the cord, often made of green silk, a color with sacred connotations in Islam, adding another layer of surreal ceremony to the act. The victim was expected to submit, with a dignity befitting his former station. Any struggle was considered unseemly. The cord was looped around his neck, and with a swift, practiced efficiency, pressure was applied. Death was quick and silent. The body was left intact, unmarked save for the faint line on the neck, a discreet testament to the Sultan's final, fatal judgment. The silk cord was the final, terrifying embodiment of the favorite's journey. Having been elevated to a position of almost royal intimacy, he became subject to its fatal protocols. He learned that the same system that could raise him to the heavens could also dispatch him with a respectful touch, ensuring that even his death would serve to reinforce the terrible and sacred mystique of the power he had once so briefly shared. For the vast majority of those who fell from favor, the end was a quiet death in a lonely room, a final, definitive erasure. However, the Ottoman system, for all its brutality, was also a deeply pragmatic and bureaucratic machine. On very rare occasions when a disgraced favorite met a specific and unusual set of criteria, a third option, a form of living death, was deemed the most expedient solution. This was the fate of unceremonious dismissal, a form of exile that was not a punishment in the conventional sense, but a strategic redeployment of a now problematic human asset. It was a solution reserved for individuals who were too well known, too popular with a segment of the court or the army, or perhaps still held into higher regard by a powerful figure like the Valide Sultan, to be simply and quietly killed without risking political fallout. The process of dismissal was an exercise in administrative subtlety. The favorite would be summoned not by the silent executioners, but by a high-ranking palace administrator, often the Grand Vizier himself. He would be informed, in polite and formal language, that the Sultan in his infinite wisdom and generosity had seen fit to recognize his long and loyal service with a prestigious appointment. He was being granted a governorship of a distant province, the Sanjak, perhaps in the remote highlands of Anatolia or the far-flung territories of the Balkans. On the surface, this was a great honor, a promotion that would make him the absolute ruler of a significant piece of imperial territory with the power to raise taxes, command local troops, and administer justice in the Sultan's name. This announcement was a perfectly constructed fiction, and every person in the room understood it as such. It was not a reward, it was a banishment. The appointment was a gilded cage of a different sort, larger and more remote, but a cage nonetheless. The specific province chosen was always a strategic calculation. It would be far enough from Constantinople to render him politically impotent, cutting him off from the networks of information and influence that were the lifeblood of the court. The province might be a notoriously troublesome one, plagued by bandits or rebellious tribes, a place where he was more likely to fail than to succeed. His appointment served a dual purpose for the central administration. It removed an inconvenient figure from the capital, and it placed him in a position where his inevitable struggles would further diminish his reputation. The departure from the palace was as swift as it was unceremonious. There was no grand farewell ceremony. He was given a short period, often no more than a day or two, to gather his personal effects and a small retinue of servants. He would be formally divested of his specific titles and garments, unpresented with the official insignia of his new provincial role. The transition was a jarring, unpublic demotion, a stripping of his identity as a court insider. One day he was the Sultan's intimate, living at the very center of the universe. The next, he was a provincial bureaucrat being hustled out of the city gates before dawn. The life that awaited him in his new post was one of profound and crushing isolation. While he held the title of governor, his actual authority was severely circumscribed. He was a known entity, a man whose fall from grace was common knowledge among the empire's political class. The local notables and military commanders in his new province would view him not as a powerful emissary from the capital, but as a political castaway. His orders would be met with a slow, passive resistance. His every action would be monitored by spies reporting directly back to the Sultan's court, ensuring he could never build a new power base. He was a figurehead, a placeholder, his title a hollow echo of real authority. This existence was a form of political purgatory. He was separated from the only world he had known for decades, a world whose intricate rules and rhythms had been imprinted onto his very soul. The provincial capital, with its dusty streets, its blunt merchants, and its rustic concerns, must have seemed like a foreign and barbarous land. He was surrounded by a language of power he no longer understood and cut off from the one he had mastered. He was a creature of the court, a hothouse flower transplanted to a barren wilderness. His health often declined rapidly in these remote posts, worn down by unfamiliar climates, and diagnosed diseases, and the sheer, grinding weight of his political irrelevance. For these few, the silk cord or the poisoned cup might have been a mercy. Instead, they were condemned to a slow, public decay, a living death sentence carried out over years, their fate serving as a more subtle, but equally potent warning to any who might aspire to the fatal intimacy of the Sultan's favor. For the vanishingly small number of individuals who survived their fall from favor and were permitted to live out their days in provincial exile, the experience was not one of liberation. To be expelled from the totalizing environment of the Topkapi Palace was not to be set free, but to be unplugged from the only source of reality and meaning one had ever known. The cage door had been opened, that the creature inside had been so profoundly shaped by its confinement that the outside world was an incomprehensible and terrifying void. The psychological difficulty of readjusting to any form of life beyond the palace walls was, for most, an insurmountable challenge, a final, crushing demonstration of the system's success in achieving a complete and irreversible remaking of the human soul. The fundamental crisis was one of identity. For his entire adult life, the former favorite sense of self had been externally derived, a reflection in the mirror of the Sultan's gaze. His worth, his purpose, his very name all were gifts bestowed upon him by the institution. His days were structured by the rigid and intricate grammar of court ritual, a language of gesture and protocol that gave meaning to every moment. In his provincial exile, this entire framework collapsed. He was no longer a gozidi, a confidant, or even a page. He was a former thing, a man defined by an absence. The complex social skills he had spent a lifetime perfecting, the ability to read the subtle mood shifts of a monarch, to deploy a line of poetry with devastating precision, to navigate the lethal currents of court intrigue were now utterly useless. They were sophisticated tools for which there were no longer any applications. This rendered him a social invalid, a man fluent in a dead language, unable to communicate effectively in the blunt, transcational world of commerce, local administration and agriculture. This loss of a functional identity was compounded by a crippling decision paralysis. The life of a page and a favorite was one of extreme discipline but almost zero autonomy. Every aspect of his existence, from the clothes he wore to the food he ate, from the hours he slept to the people he spoke with, was dictated by the strictures of the palace. His will was entirely subsumed by the will of his master. In exile, he was confronted with the terrifying burden of choice, the simple, everyday decisions that ordinary people make without a second thought became sources of profound anxiety. Which merchant should he buy his bread from? Which path should he take on his afternoon ride? These were questions he was psychologically unequipped to answer. Having lived for so long in a world of absolute certainty and rigid hierarchy, he was overwhelmed by the chaotic, unstructured nature of normal life. This often resulted in a retreat into a self-imposed version of his old life, a pathetic attempt to recreate the rigid schedules and mindless routines of the palace in his lonely governor's mansion. Furthermore, the paranoia that had been a necessary survival tool in the Enderun became a debilitating pathology in the outside world. He had been trained to see a hidden motive in every smile, a potential threat in every friendly gesture. In the court, this was an accurate assessment of reality. In a provincial town, it was a recipe for total social isolation. He was incapable of forming genuine connections because he lacked the fundamental capacity for trust. A gift from a local landowner was not a sign of respect, but a potential bribe. An invitation to a wedding was not an act of community, but a potential trap. He was a man forever looking over his shoulder, seeing assassins in every shadow, a prisoner of a threat that no longer existed. He was haunted by the ghostly state of hypervigilance that exhausted his mind and alienated everyone around him. The former favorite was thus a man suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. He was an artifact of the court, the living relic, but he was no longer a part of it. He was physically present in the world of ordinary men, but he could never truly join it. He was a man hollowed out, his original personality erased by the palace, and the palace-forged personality now rendered obsolete. This psychological disintegration was the system's final, quiet victory. It proved that one could, on rare occasion, leave the gilded cage, but the cage, with its invisible bars of memory, ritual, and trauma, could never truly be left behind. The ultimate fate of the exiled favorite, a slow fade into psychological and political irrelevance, is a fitting metaphor for the collective destiny of all who occupied this perilous role. Their very existence has been subject to a similar, far more profound form of erasure, not from a provincial town, but from the grand, official narrative of the empire they served. After tracing the arc of their violent acquisition to their often violent ends, a final, critical question remains: why is this history a ghost story? Why must the lives of individuals who held such intimate power be pieced together from fragments and whispers rather than read in the clear, decorative script of the imperial chronicles? The answer lies not in a simple lack of records, but in a deliberate and systematic policy of omission, a conscious curating of the past that was as vital to the maintenance of imperial authority as any army or bureaucracy. The primary function of the Ottoman court historian, the Volcanuvus, was not to create an objective and comprehensive account of events, as a modern historian would understand it. His role was to construct a majestic and enduring legacy for the dynasty. The chronicles were instruments of state propaganda designed to project an image of the Sultan as a pious, just, and formidable warrior king, the divinely sanctioned leader of the Islamic world. The narrative was focused on the grand sweep of history: military campaigns, the appointment of viziers, the construction of mosques, and the promulgation of laws. These were the public, monumental acts of an institution. The private, personal, and oft unmessy realities of the Sultan's inner life were considered not just irrelevant to this project, but actively detrimental to it. At the core of this omission was the concept of the Sultan's inviolable privacy. His person was sacred, and his private chambers were the sanctum sanctorum of the empire. What transpired within them was a state secret, a senior of the highest order. To document the Sultan's personal affections, his infatuations, and his intimate relationships would have been an act of profound lèse-majesté. It would have been to humanize the shadow of God on earth, to reduce the monumental figure of the Caliph to a man susceptible to mortal passions, boredom, and desire. The mystique of the ruler depended on this carefully maintained distance, this aura of unknowability. The favorite, as the living embodiment of the Sultan's most private and personal tastes, was therefore an unperson in the official record, his existence a fact to be experienced by the court, but never to be recorded for posterity. Furthermore, the legal and social status of these individuals precluded their inclusion in the formal annals of the state. They were, with few exceptions, the Sultan's slaves, his kul. Despite the immense, albeit temporary, influence they might wield, their fundamental legal status was that of property. Official histories recorded the deeds of the empire's great freeborn administrators and generals, but the intimate life of the Sultan's household was considered a domestic matter, not a political one. The rise of a favorite was, in bureaucratic terms, no different from the Sultan acquiring a new, prized Arabian horse or a particularly fine diamond. It was a matter for the household ledgers and the palace expense accounts, not for the grand chronicles of the state. Their power, though real, was entirely derivative and unofficial, leaving no paper trail of decrees or appointments. Ultimately, the erasure of the favorite from the official record was an act of dynastic self-preservation. To tell the full story would be to document a cycle of cruelty and disposability that lay at the dark heart of the system. It would mean recording the Sultan's fleeting passions, the lethal jealousy of the court, the quiet murders by poison and silk cord, and the psychological destruction of those cast into exile. It would be to write a history not of imperial glory, but of profound human weakness, paranoia, and suffering. Such a narrative would have tarnished the immaculate, idealized image of the Ottoman dynasty that the state historians were paid to create and perpetuate. The silence in the official record is, therefore, not an absence. It is a presence. It is a presence. It is a presence. It is the sound of a vast and deficient machine working to sanitize the past, to scrub away the inconvenient, emotionally complex realities of human power, leaving behind only the clean, hard, and impersonal edifice of the state. Their stories were not lost, they were deliberately unmeticulously buried. And so we reach the end of the archive on this particular chapter of human darkness. The files are closed, the whispers from the past recede, and we are left in the quiet of our own time. The journey we have taken was not simply into the gilded corridors of a long-dead empire. It was an examination of the architecture of absolute power and its effect on the human soul. We have witnessed how an institution, in its quest for perfect loyalty and control, could devise a system to systematically unmake a person to erase their past, reshape their present, and, in the end, deny them a future. The lives we have chronicled were lived at the very epicenter of a world-spanning empire, in rooms filled with a level of opulence and power that is difficult to comprehend. Yet were they ever truly there? Their proximity to the son of the Sultanate was the very thing that incinerated their individuality, rendering them beautiful, talented, and utterly disposable phantoms. They were men who became living secrets, and the price of knowing a secret is that you can never truly be known yourself. Their story is a chilling illustration of a timeless paradox that the quest for intimacy within a framework of absolute power often leads not to connection, but to a more profound and terrifying form of objectification. As we leave them now in the silent halls of history, their stories serve as a mirror. They reflect the extreme consequences of a world where human beings are treated as assets, where loyalty is a manufactured commodity, and where affection is a performance dictated by the imperatives of survival. The scale may be different, the costumes may have changed, but the underlying dynamics of fear, ambition, and the deep human need to be seen even by a gaze that can destroy remain a fundamental part of our own, more complex cages. Let the silence that follows be a moment to consider the weight of their forgotten lives. Their voices were silenced long ago. By telling their story, we give them one final echo. Let us honor it. Goodbye.